get going. Uh, okay, so hi, and welcome to our McPhee webinar on active listening for the COVID era and beyond. So today we're going to talk about some tips and techniques for improving your listening skills. And a lot of these are relevant to kind of any time period, but I wanted to take some time to think about how do we need to adapt the way we listen to other people when we're working in a remote workplace, meeting with people over Zoom or other video platforms, and how do we adapt if we're working in person but suddenly very far away from our colleagues or even wearing masks. So those are some of the things we're going to consider as we move through this topic today. My name's Elisa. I work for McPhee. I'm a managing consultant there. If you haven't met me or attended one of my webinars before, and if you don't know our firm, McPhee is a boutique organizational development consultancy based in Toronto, and we really focus on helping leaders to build high-performing teams. And also listening is a huge part of what we do and a huge part of what I teach sometimes when I get to come in and run workshops for different teams. So today we're sort of giving you a little bit of a taste of something that's really important to us. Before I get into the content, just a couple minor housekeeping things. I'll ask that if you want to ask questions, which I would encourage you to do, to please do so using the Q&A function. I don't even know if you see a chat function, but I've enabled the Q&A to go to everybody, whereas the chat would immediately go to me. So if you have any questions or comments, or you just want to participate, please go through the Q&A, and I will do my best to monitor that as we go forward. I'll also be asking some polling questions during today's webinar, so those should pop up for you and hopefully be self-explanatory, but if you have any issues with them, don't hesitate to let me know. All right, so with that, without any further ado, let's get started. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about active listening, like I promised in the title. But I also want to talk about something called mindful listening. And I kind of want to parse out those two concepts as a way for us to get started. So active listening, I think, is something that's very familiar to many of us. It's this idea that listening is not a passive thing, right? So when we're good listeners, we're not just receiving information passively, we're actively doing things so that we actually understand and integrate the new information, and so that we show the other person that we're listening. And I think this is a pretty old concept. I first learned about active listening, it's a little embarrassing, when I was in the 5th grade, and I was training to be a peer mediator to help with bullying. I'm not sure that I ever actually used those skills, but I very distinctly remember learning about leaning forward, nodding, validating people's feelings. Those are some of like the basics of active listening, and we're going to talk a bit about those today. But mindful listening is sort of a newer concept to me, and something that I thought was really interesting and that I wanted to share. So earlier this year, I was doing a mental health first aid training, which was very cool. If you haven't heard of that, I would recommend it. And our facilitator introduced this idea of mindful listening. She said that sometimes active listening becomes performative, or it becomes a bit pro forma. So you're, yes, you're smiling, yes, you're nodding, yes, you're repeating back what other people are saying, but are you really there? Are you really present? And so she said that she liked the idea of mindful listening. It's really about being in the moment when someone else is talking, not letting yourself wander too far. If your mind wanders, bringing it back to the present so that you can really be there. So you're with the person as they speak, you're paying attention to their words and their tone, but you're also paying attention to your own reaction. So a big part of mindfulness, if you practice mindfulness, is like understanding your own responses and your own body and like being at peace with that. So mindful listening brings a bit of that in, right? So you're present with the other person, but you're also present with yourself, and you understand your own reactions to the things that someone else may be sharing. So like mindful listening is really hard. Active listening is also really hard, but it's especially really hard after a long day on video chat. And I completely get that. However, I want to emphasize that it is something we want to put some time, investment, and work into. Because if we're good listeners, we're going to be better able to understand and retain information. We're going to be better able to collaborate and innovate with our team members, to build relationships, and ultimately to avoid the sometimes costly setbacks that come from miscommunication and misunderstanding. And when we work with people, I mean, this is something that comes up a lot, right? My team struggles with communication. We don't understand each other. We don't work as well together as we could. So active listening, mindful listening, This is a building block towards working on those kinds of challenges. Okay, so let's do it. Before we get into me giving you some information, I kind of wanted to hear from you. So I'm going to launch a poll, if I can get it launched, and I'll talk through it while I give you the chance to answer. So the poll is asking, what's been your biggest listening challenge or barrier during the pandemic? And I've set this up so you can choose more than one response. So the first is around your own anxiety and mental health. So I know when this first hit, it was very hard for me to focus on anything. Second is family and personal life obligations. The third is Zoom or screen fatigue, the idea of getting tired from this whole experience of being on the screen all day. The fourth is distractions during virtual meetings, whether this is people running into the room or having a million windows open. And the last one is difficulty understanding or hearing people. And this has been huge for me with masks. I'm not the best at hearing in general. And when someone's talking to me with a mask on, I have so much trouble getting what they're saying. So I'll give you guys maybe another 30 seconds to answer this poll. I can see your responses rolling in. I always love that, so thank you. And we'll sort of talk about it because I think this is important, right? If we can think about what's making it hard for us to listen, we can begin to think about what we can do to overcome those barriers. All right, so maybe we'll end the poll now and I'll show you guys the results. So the biggest by far was distractions during virtual meetings. I get this. Guilty. Super guilty. My pro tip around this is to make your meeting full screen if you can. I mean, if you can avoid it. My daughter's back in daycare now, and there's nothing I love more in a quiet moment than opening up the little screen and staring at her because we have one of those spy cams. Don't do it. Don't do it. Try to pay attention. Try to minimize those distractions. Close the windows that will distract you. Make the meeting full screen. Be there. Be present. Be mindful. Okay. Easier said than done. I know. I'm going to close the poll and we'll keep going. But yeah, I would encourage you to kind of hold that challenge close to you and think about what you can do to work on it. Okay, so here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to walk through 6 key tips to improve our active and mindful listening. For each of these, I'm going to go through some techniques that speak to some of the unique challenges that come up during COVID. So for each of these, I'll have kind of like our evergreen tips, like here's what you should always do to be a better listener, and then a few thoughts on what you can do to especially deal with some of those challenges that I think we're all dealing with right now. All right, so first things first, being a good listener, whether it's mindful or active or whatever word you like for it, it's not something you can just like suddenly achieve without thought or without effort. My first tip is that you have to kind of prepare to be a good listener. And this first bullet up on the slide, you can't pour from an empty cup. I kind of got it from those cheesy memes that I've been seeing in my mom groups. But if you haven't been seeing those memes lately, the idea is if you don't listen to yourself, then you can't really listen to others. And what do I mean by that? If you don't check in with your own needs, you can't be present for someone else. If you're exhausted, if you're overwhelmed, if you're miserable, well, of course your mind is going to wander when you're talking to other people. Of course, you might be a little bit more irritable. You might snap. You might be judgmental. You're just not going to be your best, most attentive self in engaging with others if you haven't taken some time for yourself. And I would say especially right now, because even as this crisis sort of extends and becomes more of a normal and less of an acute, I mean, right now it's probably acute for anyone with school-age children, we have to make time and space for the self-care that will set us up for success in engaging with others. So tip 1, you cannot pour from an empty cup. Don't forget to listen to yourself. I know it's hard. My second tip is a bit more tactical. There are certain times when we're more or less likely to be good listeners. So part of knowing yourself and part of preparing for a communication is doing what you can to control certain parameters to set yourself up for success. So if you are a morning person, try to get important things happening in the morning. If you have an incredibly stressful day coming up, try to push important things to a less stressful time. Now, I know that this isn't always possible, but try to think of when it can be. Often we think of our lives as like incredibly rigid and we forget some of the control that we have over our context. So really try to set yourself up for success by choosing times that make sense for you. All right. Next tip is focus on the speaker. So I want to be blunt here. In a perfect world, to be a great listener, you are actually focusing on the speaker. Um, but honestly, half the battle is making the speaker feel like you're focused on them. So I was that obnoxious kid in high school who, when the teacher was talking, I would be like doing something else. And then the teacher would ask a question and I'd raise my hand and get the answer right. And it was incredibly annoying and I enjoyed doing it. I was focused on the speaker. I was listening. I was able to answer the question, but I was being a real brat about it and probably making the teacher feel crummy. So it's not just about focusing on the speaker, it's about making the speaker feel like you are focused on them. That's the good stuff. That's going to build relationships. That's going to help with those like collaborative issues at in the workplace and elsewhere. Um, so how do you kind of show another person that you're listening? One easy way in person is to maintain eye contact. I don't mean constant eye contact because you're going to come off as creepy, but like a natural amount of eye contact. That's a little bit trickier on Zoom. So right now I'm staring at my green dot, making eye contact with you, the listener. The problem with staring at the green dot is that I actually am not focused on you. Um, so much of communication, studies have shown, is nonverbal cues, right? So if when I'm on video chat, I'm staring at my camera so that you feel like I'm staring at you, I'm actually missing out on part of your message because I'm not seeing your face, right? So while staring at the green dot is an illusion of connection, it's really going to be to the detriment of the communication overall. One kind of helpful thing is if you have control over where the people's faces go, you could move the person's face kind of right below the green dot and you sort of have the best of both worlds. But I would say people on these video chats don't expect consistent eye contact, but in person, eye contact. Um, the second thing is around body language. So you really just want your body language to say, I'm open to your ideas. I'm interested. And it's really basic, right? It's like, don't cross your arms. Have your arms be open. Lean forward, nod, smile. Um, all that's good stuff. Uh, but what about on Zoom? You are on Zoom with me right now. You don't know that I'm like 7 months pregnant because you only see me from my shoulders up. Body language is sort of different when you're in front of the camera, right? So think about the tools that are at your disposal. You really have your face in these video chats. You have your hands. Think about what tools you can use to kind of reinforce that positive body language on camera. And when you're with a mask, you don't really have your mouth anymore or your facial expressions. So you want to think about your eyes, right? I find myself like hyper smiling with my eyes when I'm wearing a mask because I want the other person to know that I am smiling. Um, Keeping those things in mind and thinking about the power of those things is important. If the other person feels like I'm paying attention to them and I'm taking that extra effort to seem engaged, it will have an impact on the communication overall. The third tip is manage distractions. We sort of talked about this already, but close your other windows, close the door, for an important conversation, try to police the boundaries of your focus so that you can focus on the speaker for real, not just making them feel like you're focusing, but actually focusing on them by cutting out distractions. And my last tip is to be mindful of technology. So our technology right now tends to be super integrated, right? So I get my texts through my computer. All my emails are pinging all the time. So, turn on your do not disturb. I like to close all tabs that make noise if I have to have an important conversation because even if it's distracting, right? So you hear this little ping and then you look at it and then you stop listening to the other person and you're no longer focusing. So hopefully there'll be no pings during today's webinar. I did go through and try to shut everything down because you really do want to take the time to focus on the other person and to make them feel like they're important. Okay, let's keep going. Oh, and one more tip about focus for tech is sometimes you can close your face, right? So sometimes the distracting thing on a video call is not your other windows, but your own face. You're like, ooh, how do I look? And that's why they say you get such Zoom fatigue because we're not used to watching ourselves and policing our appearances in regular life as much as we are on video chat. So if you can, try to close off your own face. Or if you have many people in a meeting, try to navigate the toolbar such that you see everyone else's face and not yours. That will help you to be more in the moment and more focused and mindful with other people as well. So that's another tip around tech. The third tip is to avoid interrupting. This one feels obvious, but it really has to be said. I struggle with this, full disclosure. I love to talk, if you couldn't tell. And I tend to get really excited and when I'm having an interesting conversation. And so the other person will say something and I'll be like, ooh, I want to say something too. But we really, really, really have to be careful not to talk over other people. Because, I mean, what does it say when we interrupt? It says, I don't think your voice is as important as mine. I don't think your perspective is as important as mine. And it's really, really, really not the message that we want to send to other people, right? So what do? Well, the first thing I'd say is that as with all these tips, I want you to think about it as a journey of continuous improvement. So you're never going to be perfect at communicating, and that is okay. But what you want to be doing is always improving. And part of always improving is noticing what you're doing and where you can be better and letting other people know that you're working on being better. So my very, very simple tip around interruption is that if you interrupt somebody, or better yet, when you interrupt somebody, notice that you do it. Stop, don't finish your thought, and say, oh, I'm so sorry, I interrupted you. Please continue. Maybe the person won't continue, but probably they will. And it's way better to do that than to just plow through. Because you're kind of like building a bridge and extending a gesture of goodwill. And you're working on improving and showing someone that you're doing that. In terms of avoiding interrupting, I don't have a magic tip. So if you were in person, okay, maybe there's some cues that a person gives you when they're about to wind down a thought, maybe something in their face or in their body. But on video chat, I actually find this really, really hard to know when someone's done. So I'd say just wait. Wait until the other person is done. And if you're not sure, ask them if they're done and if you can talk. And if it's a big group, use technology. If it has like a little raise hand function on the platform that you're using, don't be shy to do that. If everyone's face is on a big grid like the Brady Bunch, raise your hand. They can see you. All of these things are better than cutting someone off. My last tip around interrupting is to just treat people equally. So studies have shown that women of color are the most likely to be interrupted in the workplace. This is both unsurprising and unacceptable. So let's all, as we work on improving our communication skills and our listening skills, think about the ways in which unconscious bias colors the way in which we interact with others. Because when we shut down any voice, we're losing out on a chance for diversity of thought and for increased strength and collaboration on our team. When we're repeatedly doing this to marginalized voices, we're really missing a huge opportunity, right? So let's just make sure, I would say for all of these tips, but especially for interrupting, that we work on improving and that we work on treating everybody equally. And that's kind of my sad 2 cents on that one. My next tip is to avoid seeming judgmental. Ooh, there's a question. Oh, this is a question for my husband. I don't know if you can all see it. He says, Dr. Gurman, how important is it to have your video on during conference calls? How do you show active listening while just on audio calls? Oh, that's a really good question. So in the before times, I often did lots of phone calls with clients without videos. And what I would do was a lot of like responsive sounds, which maybe is unique to me. But I would say that like when I was conducting focus groups on the phone or executive interviews on the phone, I would always make an effort to laugh at people's jokes and to say and to ask important questions based on what people are saying. So don't just take someone's answer at face value and move on to your next question or to the next thing you want to talk about, but respond to what they said either by summarizing it or better yet by asking a probing question that either challenges what the person said or challenges people to build on what the person said, because that's how you're going to show that you're listening. In terms of the first part of your question, how important is it to have your video on during conference calls? it's like a social norms thing, right? So if everyone else on the conference call does not have their video on, I wouldn't pressure people. So it really depends on the norms in your office and in your workplace. My office is big on the video because of all the extra communication information you do get from other people. And I would encourage you to think about talking to your colleagues about how we can connect better if we do video. But video can be exhausting, and some people don't want to let you in to their face and to their home at all times. So we also want to respect people's privacy and kind of respect the cultural norms that are in place in a given institution. But thanks for that question. And you can let me know if I didn't answer that question. I'll give it a like. I don't know what that does, but maybe you can see that I liked your question. So I answered it live. Okay, so let's keep going. Tip 4, avoid seeming judgmental. This one's also really hard. So I recently, maybe like about a year ago, when I presented this content many times, but once when I did it about a year ago, I got some interesting feedback. It was very funny. So at the end of the session, we tend to ask people, what was your key takeaway? And like 80% of people's key takeaway from this one was control your face, which I don't even remember if I had said it, but I must have said it. So avoid seeming judgmental, all about controlling your face. I've stolen back that language. Okay, so this is again one that's about optics. We're all judgmental. Sorry, we are. We all make flash judgments on each other. We all judge what other people are saying. We all have emotional responses to what people are saying. That I think is inevitable. Where it can become problematic is when we allow negative judgments of others to come through inappropriately in conversation. So what do I mean by this? I can think of a mortifying example that I don't need to go into because it's embarrassing, where someone said something and I immediately groaned, like a yeah right kind of groan. And as soon as the groan came out of my mouth, I just wished the groan was gone. I was like, how could I have done that? I just seemed so judgmental. I just shut down that other person without even really saying anything. What a waste. What a stupid thing to do. So that's kind of what I mean when you seem judgmental. It can come across in your facial expression, like, oh God. That can be a groan. It can be a sigh. It can be something verbal that you say. And why is this problematic? Well, there's no problem with pushing back on our colleagues or people we're talking to. There's no problem with challenging people we're talking to. But there's something in those dismissive, judgmental responses that just shut down discussion, right? So if I groan in a yeah right way at you, we're not collaborating anymore, right? It's not a good communication situation anymore. So what can you do? Well, what did I do in that instance? I apologized. It was really awkward and embarrassing, but I did bring that person aside after and say, I'm so sorry, that was so inappropriate. I have stuff going on. It has nothing to do with you. Even if it maybe did have something to do with him. It doesn't matter. I needed to put that away. So don't be afraid to apologize if you mess up, but this is one where you want to avoid messing up. So it really is that control your face tip. So as much as you can, if someone's saying something to you that's upsetting or that makes you angry, it's okay to respond in a way that is upset or angry, but you want to do it with control and you want to do it with intention so that you can make it professional and productive. So take a pause, even if you need to respond to that thing later, not in the moment. Like I need to think about that, and think about how you're going to raise your objections or your concerns or your emotional response in a way that you feel is going to work well for you. And in the moment, just try to control your face. This is where Zoom is actually your friend. You can say poor connection and turn off your video for a minute and just be like, oh my God. And then come back. So no one says you have to be honest all the time. But really, again, this is about continuous improvement, and this is about optics, because we all know how it would feel if someone shut us down in that way, and where that would go. So avoid seeming judgmental. My next tip is to show your interest. I'll keep us going here. So we've been kind of working towards this all along, but it's worth saying. When you make people feel like you're actually interested in what they have to say, you're going to do all that good stuff that listening does, right? You're going to build relationship. You're going to build trust. You're going to build an environment where people feel empowered and comfortable sharing their perspectives. And on teams where that's the case, everybody is a winner. So how do you do this? The first is that you actually respond genuinely. So even though this is about listening, listening just isn't about smiling and nodding. How do I really show you that I'm listening to what you're saying? Well, I actually respond to what you're saying. So that means I ask you an intelligent question about what you're saying. It means I challenge you about what you're saying. It means I say something that builds on what you're saying. What it doesn't mean is that I hop in to share my own story that's sort of relevant, but really, I just really, really wanted to share my own story, and it doesn't have so much to do with what you just said. Um, we don't want to just talk next to each other. We want to talk to each other, if that makes sense. The next tip is to remember details. So your active listening is not just limited to the interaction. You show people that you're a good listener if later at another meeting or when you see the person casually or in an email, you reference something that they said. I think we can all think of a time when someone did that for us, and we can all remember how it made us feel. So it's really just about showing that you heard and showing that you listened. And finally, remember body language. So we talked about this before. I don't want to repeat this again, but use your body, even behind a screen or even with a mask on, to show people that you're engaged and interested in what they have to say. Finally, an oldie but a goodie, play back what you have heard. This is really simple, but really effective. So basically, when someone is done speaking, and you shouldn't do this all the time, you're going to sound very strange, but when someone is done speaking some of the time, take a minute to repeat back some of the key points that they said and ask them if you've understood, or build on it, or ask a question, etc., etc. So a lot of my tips today have been about making the other person feel like you're listening. This one is actually about listening. Because research has shown that immediately after listening to a 10-minute oral presentation, the average listener has heard, understood, and retained about 50% of what was said. Within 48 hours, that drops off to 25%. So 2 days after hearing a 10-minute presentation, you remember a quarter of what you heard. We're not good at really listening to what other people say, but we are good at remembering what we say and what we think. So by repeating back what someone says, not only are you checking if you understand, not only are you forcing yourself to stay in the moment, but you're internalizing a little bit of that knowledge and making it a little bit part of yourself and having a better chance of remembering it a couple days later. So it's kind of a retention technique too. And there you have it. Those are my 6 tips for improving your active listening in COVID and beyond. 1, prepare to be a good listener. 2, focus on the speaker. 3, avoid interrupting. 4, avoid seeming judgmental. 5, show your interest. And 6, play back what you've heard. And I wanted to end with one more poll. Oops, come back. I'm going to share poll 2. At the end of sessions like these, or when we do like a real big workshop at McPhee, we don't normally do 30-minute Elisa Talks for 30-minute sessions, I promise. We always ask people, what's one thing that you're going to do differently now that we've had this conversation? So I kind of want to do like a mini version of that. I hope that after this, there's something that you want to work on as you move forward in the coming days. And I would love to force you to choose that thing and also hear from you what that new behavior is. So if you could just take a second. I think for this one, I only let you pick one. What's one thing you're going to work on in the coming days? And it's all from these steps you'll be choosing. Maybe I'll give another 20 seconds. That will have given people a minute to think about it. And so I guess my thought is like, take what you chose today and combine that with the barrier point you chose today and think about what can I do to mitigate or get past that challenge that I identified at the beginning of our session? And what can I do to action this tip that I've decided is most important for me? So I'll end the poll and share the results. And the biggest one was avoid interrupting. So that makes me feel less alone because that's mine too. Awesome. So I hope you have great success in working on that. And I would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions or comments about what we talked about today, if you want to check in, if you want to learn more, don't be a stranger. I'm always around. McPhee team's always around. You can send me an email at elisa@mcphee.ca. And if you want to stay in touch or keep on top of our webinars or other events that we may be holding, virtual or otherwise, can sign up for our newsletter at mcphee.ca/newsletter-invite. Have a great day, and thank you for listening.